What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you the indie games I have enjoyed playing the most this year, as it has been honestly a pretty big year for big releases thus far, and I thought I would take a moment to instead talk about some of the smaller games that I've really been enjoying, which includes a handful of new releases from this year, as well as a couple of older releases from last year and much earlier than that even. But something you may very well have heard me say if you watch the channel much is that after reviewing hundreds of games, the things that tend to stick out to me the most personally these days are games that do something unique. Even if they don't wind up being my favorites, I tend to just remember them more because of that unique thing that they did. And I have found increasingly that the odds of that happening tend to pop up more with indie titles, which is probably unsurprising given that oftentimes these are the types of games that can afford to take more risks, and sometimes that just happens to pay off. Now that is a bit of survivorship bias, to be clear. There's plenty of failed projects that I never see that took those risks and just didn't make it. But honestly, that kind of leans into why I think it is important to talk about these kinds of games. And so with that said, let's actually dive in and do just that. So, kicking it off with the most recent indie title I took a look at, which was actually the Necromancer's Tale. A very specific, narratively driven CRPG that just released, telling the story of a necromancer's rise to power during the 1700s. And as I was saying before release, that I think actually wound up coming true more or less, it's an incredibly specific experience. But if that experience is something you're after, it is very, very good. Now, this game pretty much immediately stood out to me because of how much care it took in kind of elaborating upon the arcane rituals and things one might theoretically undergo as part of the transformation process into things like a lich or simply raising the dead in the context of a fantasy game. And I think really the only game that's done something even remotely comparable is like the Lich Mythic Path and Wrath of the Righteous. And even then, that's just a portion of the game and not, an entire focus here. So it's like you took that particular questline and really, really fleshed it out and expanded upon it. And again, if you're into that, it's awesome. It is probably unsurprisingly, though, a fairly janky, kind of clunky experience at times. Things like controls, pathfinding, that kind of stuff could certainly do with a little bit of polish, but given the overall scope and size of this game, not exactly a huge surprise. And if you're willing to get past some of that jank, it's an awesome time. Which then brings us to our second entry. Another more recent title, we have Eriksholm, The Stolen Dream, which was a really cool stealth puzzle game that went really hard on the cinematics. Like, these cinematics are genuinely like AAA quality, in my opinion. They are really, really good. However, the actual game itself is like an isometric stealth game, and I think all the work they put into those cutscenes kind of inflated the price of the game, which is a shame because it's really great and I wish people had the chance to play more of it, because on top of those cutscenes and an interesting story, Eriksholm is actually pretty fun to engage with just purely on the actual puzzle side of things. Now, I've played a fair few stealth tactics games at this point, and while I enjoy that genre overall, the thing about Eriksholm is that it is a puzzle in the sense that there tends to only be like one primary solution, whereas the tactics titles usually give you a little more variety than that. But even still, the puzzles were a lot of fun. I enjoyed figuring them out. I really enjoyed how reactive the various characters and NPCs would be to the things you are doing, like, coming over to check if a guard doesn't pop in, or, all the conversations they'll be having back and forth, how they react to things happening in the map itself. And honestly, one of the more enjoyable, shorter experiences I've had this year. The entire thing took me about 14 hours, and it was a really good time all the way through. That does bring us to our third entry, however, and this one is a little bit older in the sense that it actually released last year. I just finally got around to playing it this year because I was a little busy at the time this game released, but that is, of course, Bloomtown, A Different Story. It must be said straight away that for a game that takes place sort of on a summer vacation, this game was a really great game to play during the summertime, as again, just fairly short as far as, RPGs go, I suppose. Adventure that sees you guiding a group of kids through pacts with the devil, fighting off demons as they try to protect their little town that they're enjoying, Bloomtown, if you'd believe it. Now, while this game, I think, does have a few balance issues, they are not so bad as to get in the way of the honestly kind of fun juxtaposition of the really serious content and themes that surround this, things like PTSD, child abuse, stuff like that, but it's all kind of explained through the eyes of these kids that are just trying to get by in their summer at their grandfather's while their parents get divorced. But obviously, from what you can see in the game itself, it's still kind of like weirdly bright and cheery at the same time, and it creates this sort of just odd mix of what this game winds up being. And that's before you even get into all the fun like side content having to do with things like aliens, witches, the spirits and demons you have to fight off. Bloomtown was just a really fun overall good time. And that's to say absolutely nothing of the art. I really love the pixel art in this game. I think they did a fantastic job with it. And all things considered, pretty easy to see why it reviewed as well as it did. But that does bring us into much older territory with Avernum 1. So Avernum 1 is a bit complicated in the sense that the version I played, Avernum Escape from the Pit, is a remake of a game that released all the way back in the 1990s. Now the reason I was playing this indie title this year is that Avernum 4, the fourth of 6 games that make up 2 trilogies, is actually releasing later this year. So the reason I was playing these was to get prepped for that release, because the Spiderweb Software CRPGs are some of the more notable ones that I have not covered and played up to this point, and that's kind of like my whole thing. Now, having already finished the first Avernum trilogy, 1 through 3, I can safely say that Avernum 1 was my favorite overall by far. And that's because I think it's the one that makes the biggest use of the, general concept of being a group of people either fairly or unfairly dropped into a cavern system known as Avernum that rises up to fight back the Empire who sent them down there to begin with. You explore all these caves, everything is sort of alien and mysterious, and while the second game goes on to make a lot of fun improvements to just a large variety of like quality of life type stuff and even some pacing and whatnot, it still just doesn't hit quite as hard as that first game does. The third one in the trilogy has actually been my least favorite thus far because it's a little too spread out, tries to do a little too much, I think, with this monster plague system and like destroyable cities and whatnot. But as a result of that, all that to say that Avernum 1 Escape from the Pit holds up surprisingly well, which is why it's on my list of favorite indies all the way here in 2025 that I've been playing this year. Of the games from Spiderweb Software that I have played, I think this one's probably the most sharply written, and while I enjoy the, overall context of things like their Geneforge series a bit more, I really loved the writing of this particular game. And digging into the nitty-gritty of every little town that has established itself down here as you try to ingratiate yourself with this sort of underground empire, searching for answers yourself, which culminate in 3 different endings that you can do all in one playthrough, which consists of I guess what you could call the true ending. It was just a really great time if you're into that sort of thing. And I wanted to highlight how much fun I have had with that. Now, the very last game I want to get into for this particular list might be a little controversial in the sense that I think it's honestly probably pushing into the AA space, so if you would like to argue that it's not an indie, you are more than welcome to, because that game is The Alters. But The Alters is developed and published by 11-Bit Studios, which are themselves mostly an indie games publisher. They've also made a few games themselves, and in fact, what first put me onto The Alters was the fact that I have played a lot of 11-Bit's previous work and really enjoyed it. Though in more than a few cases, they've just been the publisher behind these games and not the actual developer. Such was the case for things like Indica or The Thaumaturge. Either way, I would say 11-Bit Studios mostly hangs out in the indie space, with The Alters being the first game they've put out that I think you could, again, is arguably a little more AA. But the reason I decided to include it is because past the story concepts, the game itself is really simple stuff. Basically just some very basic survival craft type things where you build a base, take care of people, that kind of stuff. So it's really just nothing remarkable in that regard. But the reason I enjoyed it so much is because of what I stated at the beginning of the video. Things that do something unique tend to stand out to me more and be more enjoyable as a result. And The Altar does that in spades because the concept is basically that in order to survive a hostile planet, you have to clone yourself many times, but the catch is these clones are a bit different than you in the sense that they have different memories and lived a different life and have, as a result, different feelings about those things, including entirely different personalities. So you spend much of the game trying to manage the voices, but they're not in your head so much as outside of you. So you're talking with all of these different aspects and variations of your own character, and you can't even see them all in one playthrough. You have to do at least 2. if you want to see all of them. And then all of that even is actually still up against the backdrop of the wider problem at home, because you were sent to this planet to gather some special material to help combat the food crisis that is happening back on Earth. And I really did just have a blast with it. But as much as I've enjoyed all these games, I hope I at least put a couple of them onto your radar, or at the very least you could tell me what indie games you yourself are enjoying the most this year. I know for a fact there's a few that have passed me by just because I haven't had the time. But whether you enjoyed these or you were thinking of something else, I'd be more than happy to hear about the games you are playing on top of what you think about these. But for the time being, I think that's pretty much going to do it for this video. Certainly hope you enjoyed it. If you did, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.